My name is Lillian Hart, and everything I know about being good was taught in loud voices and practiced in silence. My father is Pastor Elijah Hart, a man of firm words and eyes that see everything, even when they are closed in prayer. I grew up beneath the stained glass windows of the church, where every choice seemed already made for me. I knew exactly how to dress, how to behave, what to say, and, more importantly, what to keep quiet. I was a framed girl, the perfect daughter, the living promise of a legacy I was never asked if I wanted to carry. But the day they buried the sheriff's wife, something in my world shifted, not because of the death or the tears, but because of the man standing in the shadow of the oldest oak tree in the cemetery. Rowan Blake. No one knew his name then, but he was already a whisper. Tall, lean, with shoulders heavy from a past that didn't explain itself in words. He didn't approach anyone, didn't join the prayers, didn't bow his head. He just stood there, still, as if waiting for the world to end in silence. And then, for a moment, our eyes met. I'm not the type to believe in fate, but there was something in that look that cut through me like a hot knife through ice. He wasn't just any stranger. He was someone carrying a secret, a burden. And, though it felt crazy to think so soon, something in me knew that secret had something to do with me. That night at dinner, my father mentioned that a man had rented the old Mayfield house and that it was best to keep our distance. He said no one knew his story, and when my father doesn't know something, it automatically becomes a threat. He ended the sentence with his eyes on me, as if expecting me to nod obediently in agreement. I just lowered my gaze and kept pushing food around my plate, but inside, something stirred. A strange restlessness, as if the part of me that had always been passive was starting, for the first time, to breathe on its own. I spent the night with my eyes open, the ceiling of my room feeling farther away than ever. His name wasn't known to me yet, but his image already took up space in my mind. Not out of vanity or infatuation, but discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes before a big change, because there was something about him that didn't fit. And everything that doesn't fit in this place ends up sooner or later finding a mirror in me. Maybe that's why I felt him before I knew who he was. Maybe that's why I understood, without words, that he wasn't running. He was waiting for someone to see him, and without knowing why, I'd already started looking. In the days that followed, Rowan Blake became a kind of visible shadow in town. Always there, but never where they expected. People said he spent hours on the porch of the Mayfield house, reading coverless books and staring at nothing, like he was listening to conversations no one could hear. Others swore they saw him talking to old Jonas, the recluse no one visits, who's lived alone since his daughter died, and talks to trees like they're kin. There were rumors. There always are. But what bothered me most was how everyone seemed to slot him into a theory before even asking his name. And maybe because I'd been slotted into molds my whole life, seeing it happen to an outsider sparked the anger in me I didn't know how to name. I'd see him from a distance, on Main Street, sometimes at the market, rarely at church. When he did go, he sat in the back, alone, eyes fixed on the floor, as if he were there out of habit or respect, not faith. And even without approaching anyone, he seemed to stir an odd unease in people, as if his mere presence exposed truths no one wanted to admit. Even my mother, always kind, remarked to the neighbors that he had a gaze too heavy for a man so young. I didn't say anything, but I understood. It was the same kind of weight I carried inside. The difference was, he didn't hide it. The first time we spoke wasn't grand. It was casual, almost small. I was in the church library organizing boxes of old books when he appeared at the door, asking if there was any poetry among the donations. His voice was deep but calm, like it had once been loud and learned to hold back. I was surprised to see him there but didn't show it. I just pointed to a stack in the corner and kept sorting my papers, as if my heart wasn't beating harder, for no reason at all. He thanked me with a nod and walked slowly to the corner like he knew the place better than he should. "This book has your name on the inside cover," he said after a few minutes, holding up a blue-bound volume. When I looked, I recognized it. It was mine. An old edition of Emily Dickinson I'd donated without much thought, figuring I'd never have time for poetry again. He handed it to me. "Want it back?" I shook my head. "Keep it. I think she'd like you more than me." He smiled for the first time. A small smile, from someone unused to it, but who still remembered how. "No. She'd just say you shouldn't have given up so easily." I don't know why those words hit me the way they did. Maybe because he'd read more than the inside cover. Maybe because in that moment I knew Rowan Blake wasn't someone who just observed. He was someone who saw. And there's something dangerous about being fully seen when you've spent your whole life trying to be invisible inside. That night, I came home with the book in hand and a feeling hard to explain. Like he'd somehow given me back a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing. The next morning, my father made a point of reading a whole passage from Leviticus before breakfast. His voice sounded heavier than usual, like each word was hand-picked not to teach, but to remind us who he was in that house. He didn't name names or look straight at me, but the subtext screamed. He knew. Someone must have told him. Maybe the librarian, maybe a sister from the congregation, maybe no one. But men like my father don't need proof to decide what's true. One move off script and the judgment begins. Silent but absolute. I finished my coffee in silence. Avoided the open Bible on the table, avoided my mother's gaze, avoided even myself, because part of me still hoped things could go back to how they were. But it was too late. Once someone truly sees you, there's no unseeing it. And Rowan had done that. Without pushing, without forcing, just seeing. In the days that followed, he started showing up at the library more often. We exchanged few words, but there was something in how time stretched between us that made the silence feel like company. I liked how he moved slowly between the shelves, like he was searching for answers in old books, like he believed truth was always hidden on some forgotten page. I started noticing things, how he wrote in a brown notebook, always close at hand, in small, firm letters. How he'd pause for long minutes by the window, staring at something no one else could see. How he asked more about others than himself, like someone with a past too big, who'd rather carry others' weight just to feel lighter. One afternoon, while we were reorganizing a cabinet full of church files, he held up an old photograph, showed it to me without a word. It was a yellowed portrait, serious faces in formal clothes. He pointed to a man in the corner and asked if I knew who it was. I looked closely. My stomach turned before the answer came. It was my grandfather. I'd recognized that gaze in any era, stern, straight, like my father's. The name handwritten on the back confirmed it. James Elijah Hart, and standing beside him, a dark-haired boy with a scared expression. Below the image, a date, 1983. "Why do you have this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "Because I was there," he replied. No emotion, no hesitation. The floor seemed to slip beneath me. I didn't ask anything else. I took the photo, put it back in the folder, and locked the cabinet with trembling hands. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours with that picture in my head, trying to recall what I knew about my grandfather beyond the stories repeated in my father's sermons. But there were gaps. Small absences I'd always accepted as unimportant, but that now felt like they hid more than they revealed. That Sunday, during the service, My father preached about the danger of wolves in sheep's clothing, about evil that comes smiling, about how the enemy often hides in the details. I listened with a racing heart and cold hands. He didn't know what I knew, but he was already gearing up to fight what he didn't understand. And for the first time, instead of feeling guilty, I felt angry. It was the end of the illusion, of comfort, of automatic obedience. I was still the pastor's daughter, but I wasn't the same. And Rowan wasn't just a stranger. I was never good with secrets. I learned to hide them well, to swallow words and control my face, but they always cost me something. A piece of me, a lost night's sleep, a headache no one could cure. Since I saw that photograph, everything inside me started weighing more. The world around me stayed the same routines, same faces, same ready-made phrases. But I felt like I was walking underwater, where the air is thicker and everything sounds muffled. And down there, my grandfather's name echoed with a weight I'd never felt before. Rowan didn't seek me out in the days that followed. Maybe he knew I needed silence, or maybe he was fighting his own battle out of the town's sight. But I thought about him, about his eyes when he said he was there, about the boy beside my grandfather in that photo, about the whole life. They told me as if it were complete, but that I now knew was full of torn-out pages. In the library, I started searching alone, not out of curiosity, but survival. I dug through old church records, newspapers from the 80s, membership lists, obituaries, baptisms, anything that might give me a clue. I found crossed out names, missing documents, dates that didn't line up. A footnote mentioned a fire at a shelter in the next town over in 1984 that left several children unaccounted for, one of them with the last name Blake. It was just a line that burned like hot iron when I read it. I took the clipping to my mother, sat with her in the kitchen, and waited for the teapot to whistle before speaking. She tried to pretend she didn't recognize the name, then tried to brush it off, said it was in the past, that it wasn't my business. But when I stood to leave, she grabbed my wrist, and with teary eyes she said, "Your grandfather was a hard man, sometimes harder than he needed to be." I didn't reply. I just pulled away gently, like slipping my hand from a rope about to snap. That night, I knocked on the door of the Mayfield house. When Rowan answered, he didn't look surprised, like he knew I'd come. He let me in without a word. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that doesn't need explanation, just presence. Then he handed me a cardboard box. Inside were letters, clippings, and a diary in a woman's handwriting I didn't know. His mother's. The pages spoke of broken promises, an escape, a man named James Hart, my grandfather, who once vowed to protect her but left her behind. That's when I realized Rowan wasn't here by chance. He was returning, not to destroy, but to remember, and I was caught between memory and blood, between the love starting to grow inside me and the weight of a truth that could shatter everything my family had built. I didn't cry. Not then. I just closed the box, took a deep breath, and looked into his eyes. "Why did you trust me with this?" he answered without hesitation. "Because unlike your grandfather, you listen." And in that answer, even with my chest in pieces, I felt something unexpected, relief. Because for the first time, someone didn't want me to pretend. They wanted me to know, to feel, to choose. And that's exactly what I was about to do. I started seeing everything differently, not because the world had changed, but because I now knew where to look for the cracks. What once seemed solid and reliable now felt fragile, built on secrets, carefully buried. My grandfather, the man revered in my father's sermons, wasn't just a prestigious name. He was the source of a pain that had been dragging through generations, and now it was alive, breathing in front of me in the form of Rowan Blake. I spent days rereading his mother's diary. It was like stepping into a room locked for decades and finding the air still warm. She wrote with a mix of faith and fear, describing the days she spent hiding, waiting for help that never came. She spoke of the man who promised to protect her, who took her away with vows of salvation, then left her alone with a small child in her arms. The last entry simply read, "He never came back, and still I pray for him." I closed the notebook with trembling hands. I didn't know what was worse, the truth or the silence that covered it for so long. Every time I returned home, it felt like the walls were watching me. My father grew grimmer, more rigid. His words during services took on a sharper edge, like he was preaching against something or someone. Deep down, I knew. He sensed it. He saw something in me he couldn't control. And like any man who fears what he can't dominate, he reacted with force. On a stifling Wednesday night, he called me to talk, spoke about doctrine, reputation, lineage, then mentioned Rowan without saying his name, said there were men who fed on others' weaknesses, who came from outside to sow division between father and daughter, faith and flesh. I listened with a tight heart. He didn't know I already knew. He didn't imagine how his fervent defense of a clean past only highlighted how much he feared the dirt hidden beneath the altar. When he finished, he looked into my eyes, still expecting submission. I didn't give it. I thanked him for the talk, went upstairs, and locked myself in my room. I cried for Rowan's mother, for him, for me, for all the women who learned to silence their stories out of fear of destroying the men's. That night I wrote a letter, not to send, just to get it off my chest. In it I confessed I no longer knew what it meant to be a daughter, or what it meant to be just. But that, for the first time, I was willing to find out, alone if I had to. In the days that followed, I avoided Rowan, not out of anger or shame, but because something in me still needed to settle. But he didn't wait. He came to me, walked into the church while I was finishing sweeping the empty hall, and stood there, like he carried a confession on his shoulders. When I saw him, my heart raced. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a photo. It was him as a child, in the arms of a woman with a tired smile, on the back, scribbled by hand, for when you forget who you are. She'd say that to me when I felt lost, he murmured. And now, do you feel like you've forgotten? No, but I think you're starting to remember. His words undid me, like he'd touched something I didn't even know existed. And there, in the sacred emptiness of that church, I felt that everything I'd been taught about right and wrong was too small to hold what I felt now, because what I felt wasn't guilt. It was love. It was fury. It was hope. It was all tangled up inside me, nameless but whole. And I knew what lay ahead wouldn't be light, but it was inevitable. The town started whispering his name, first in subtle questions. Have you seen that guy from the Mayfield house? He seems so alone, doesn't he? Then as warnings. It's not good for someone with an uncertain past to get so close to the pastor's daughter. Every word carried more weight than it seemed. I could feel them piling onto my back, like stones hidden in the pocket of a pretty dress. It didn't matter how much I smiled or pretended normalcy. People were sniffing out something that didn't yet have a name, and my father, even without saying it, already ninth, he was losing control. Nights became the only place I could still be whole. It was when my mind, exhausted from restraint, let me feel without filters, and what I felt for Rowan was no longer confusion. It was pain and beauty in equal measure, a tenderness that made me want to protect him from the world, and at the same time protect myself from everything he represented. His past stood between us, not as a ghost, but as a wall without a door. And still, I pressed my forehead against it every time he said my name. One afternoon, I found my mother in the garden, sitting with her hands in her lap, her gaze lost among the flowers. She called me softly and said she dreamed of Rowan's mother, said she watched her silently from the other side of a bridge. My mother isn't a woman of dreams or metaphors. It struck me in a strange way. When I got closer, she took my hand and said, "Sometimes we carry guilt that isn't ours, daughter, and even so, it turns into wounds." I don't know if she knew everything, maybe just enough. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Her tenderness was the truest thing I felt that day, and I held on to it like a prayer. That same night, I went back to Rowan's house with a heavy heart and empty hands. He greeted me with tired eyes, like he'd spent hours deciding whether to let me in. We sat on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes, papers, and memories that weren't mine. I asked if he felt anger, at my family, at my grandfather, at me. He said the anger had passed, but what remained now was sadness, and an emptiness he'd never managed to fill, until now. Then he looked at me with a care that made me want to cry, like I was the last good thing the world had given him. We stayed there, sitting in the silence that only exists between two people who no longer need explanations. And when he pressed his forehead to mine, he whispered, "You're the only thing that doesn't hurt." And I felt, with all the certainty I'd never had, that I was falling in love with someone who carried abandonment's weight with a dignity no pastor could teach. But I also knew, in that instant, that time was running out, because what we had was strong, but not invisible. And sooner or later, what's on the margins always gets dragged to the center of the altar. The next morning, my father was waiting at the table. The Bible was open, but he wasn't reading. He just looked at me and said, "Do you know what you're doing?" I took a deep breath and answered, "I know I don't want to lie anymore." That was it. And in that moment, I knew the silent war we'd been living in that house was about to go public. He didn't yell, just stood and left. But the emptiness he left in that chair was bigger than any sermon he'd ever preached. I stayed there, alone, head high, heart trembling, knowing that from that moment on, nothing I said would be enough to protect what I felt. And still, with no regrets. Because sometimes loving is choosing not to hide, even when everything around you demands silence. The morning everything broke, I dressed more slowly than ever. I buttoned my dress one by one, like I was stitching courage into the fabric. I looked in the mirror and didn't see rebellion or defiance. I saw resolve. I saw the woman I'd been becoming in silence, day by day, between questions that grew faster than the verses they gave me as answers. The church was the same, but I no longer entered it as a daughter shaped to obey. I entered as someone whole, and too whole to fit the space they'd built for me. The service started like any other. Voices rose in hymns, hands lifted, eyes closed, but a weight hung in the air. It was like everyone knew that day wouldn't end like the ones before. My father stepped up to the pulpit with his worn Bible and his voice trained to guide. He began with faith, obedience, vigilance. Then, without warning, he said Rowan's name, not with rancor, with coldness, a clean, calculated tone that hurt more than a shout. He spoke of harmful influence, strangers who infiltrate, daughters who stray. He didn't look at me directly, but the whole town knew who he was preaching to. My body moved before I decided. I stood, and the wooden pew creaked loudly. Every head turned, some with surprise, others with disapproval, a few with hope. I walked to the front of the altar and stopped beside him. I felt his unease, but didn't waver. I took the microphone from his hands, with respect, but without asking. I took a deep breath and let my voice come. It didn't shake. I told him what I knew, what I'd found. Rowan's mother's diary, the photo with my grandfather, the pages torn from our history. I spoke of the scars I'd inherited without knowing, the lies painted over with silence, how holiness sometimes serves more to hide than reveal. And I spoke of Rowan, not as a mistake, but as a mirror, as someone who showed me everything true in me, after a lifetime of hiding even from God who I was. I spoke about love, not the idealized, clean, accepted kind, but the kind that grows where no one expects, the kind that resists shame, fear, pressure, that doesn't ask permission, but arrives to heal. And then I spoke of myself, the girl raised to stay quiet, the woman who decided not to anymore. There was no scandal in my voice. There was peace, and true peace disarms even what's ready to strike. When I finished, I handed the microphone back and stepped down from the altar. My mother was crying quietly in the third pew. My father stood still, gripping the Bible so hard his knuckles were white. But he didn't say anything, because deep down, he knew. He carried the silence of what was never said too. Outside, Rowan was leaning against the fence, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on me. He didn't move, didn't speak. But that look was enough, because there, between the end of everything that trapped me and the start of everything still uncertain, I knew I'd made the only possible choice, to be true and to love, even if it meant walking against everything I'd been taught. We didn't leave that day. We didn't drop everything, like they do in movies. We stayed, to rebuild among the rubble, to show there are ways to resist without running, that you can love without erasing your name, without cutting roots, just planting new ones, deeper, truer. Today, when I pass the church, I still hear murmurs. There are still those who look at me with suspicion, but there are also those who look with different eyes, eyes that recognize in me the courage they didn't have. And that's enough. I'm still Lillian Hart. But now when I say my name, it doesn't just carry the weight of an old surname. It carries choice, voice, story, and a love no one can erase anymore.